The rattling of the stagecoach wheels against the dusty trail came to an abrupt halt, jerking Josephine Darby forward in her seat as tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. It was 1876, and the unforgiving Montana Territory sprawled before her like an endless sea of uncertainty. She'd spent the last of her money on this journey west, fleeing a past that haunted her every waking moment. Josephine wiped at her face with a handkerchief that had once been white but was now stained with the grime of travel and the salt of her tears. The driver called out, announcing their arrival at Pinewood Creek, a settlement barely deserving to be called a town. Through the small window of the stagecoach, she could see a handful of wooden buildings lining a single dusty street, their facades weathered by sun and time. "Last stop, madam," the driver said, opening the door and extending a hand to help her down. Josephine stepped onto the hard-packed dirt, her legs shaky after days of travel. She wore her wedding dress, the only decent clothing she owned, now wrinkled and soiled from the journey. The driver handed down her single carpet bag, so light it might as well have been empty. "I'll be needin' payment for transportin' your trunk," he said, gesturing to the small wooden chest secured to the back of the coach. Josephine's breath caught in her throat. I don't have any money left. I thought the fare covered everything." The driver's expression hardened. $5 for the trunk, madam. Coach fare is separate from luggage." "Please," she whispered, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "Everything I own is in there." "Not my problem, madam. No payment, no trunk." Josephine clutched her carpetbag tightly, watching helplessly as the driver climbed back onto his perch. He wouldn't even look at her now. In moments, the stagecoach would depart, taking with it the last of her possessions, her mother's silver hairbrush, her father's pocket watch, the few pieces of clothing she had managed to save. "Wait!" a deep voice called out, and the sound of boots crunching on dirt approached from behind her. Josephine turned to see a tall man striding toward them. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a well-worn Stetson, but she could make out a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble. He wore a dusty denim shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-bronzed forearms, and a gun belt hung low on his hips. "What seems to be the trouble here?" the man asked, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "No trouble," the driver replied. "Just business. Lady can't pay for her trunk's transport." The stranger reached into his pocket and pulled out several coins. "Will this cover it?" The driver counted the money, nodded with satisfaction, and promptly unloaded the trunk, setting it down beside Josephine before climbing back onto the coach without another word. With a crack of his whip, the horses lurched forward, and the stagecoach rumbled away in a cloud of dust. Josephine stood there, utterly mortified, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. I can't repay you," she managed to say between quiet sobs. "I have nothing." The man stepped closer, and now she could see his face clearly. He was handsome in a rugged way, with deep blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. He wasn't young, perhaps in his early 30s, but his face bore the lines of someone who spent most of his life outdoors rather than age. "My name's Franklin Harrington," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Most folks around here just call me Frank." "Josephine Darby," she replied, trying to compose herself but failing miserably as another sob escaped her lips. Frank studied her for a long moment, taking in the wedding dress, the tear-streaked face, and the meager belongings. "You're the mail-order bride for Thomas Blackwell, aren't you?" Josephine nodded, clutching her handkerchief tightly. "Yes, but when I arrived at his homestead outside of Billings, I found it abandoned. The neighbors said he'd died of fever 2 months ago." Her voice broke. "No one bothered to send word." Frank's expression softened. "And you spent everything you had getting here." "Everything," she confirmed, looking down at her muddied dress. "This is all I have left." He was quiet for a moment, Then he said gently, "You've brought enough, Miss Darby." "How can you say that?" she asked, gesturing to her pitiful belongings. "I have nothing but tears to my name." Frank's lips curved into a kind smile. "You've brought enough. You brought you." The simple words, spoken with such sincerity, caused Josephine to look up at him in surprise. "This territory needs good people more than anything else," he continued. "And I reckon anyone who'd travel this far on a promise is someone worth having around." Frank picked up her trunk with ease. "Come on. My ranch is about 3 miles outside of town. I've got a spare room in the house where you can stay until you figure out what's next. No strings attached." Josephine hesitated, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing but the clothes on my back," he replied simply. "Besides, I could use some help around the ranch. My cook quit last month, and I've been living on beans and bacon ever since." A hint of humor glinted in his eyes. "If you can cook better than I can, which wouldn't be hard, you can earn your keep that way." Josephine considered her options, which were painfully few. She could stay in town and try to find work, but with no money for lodging and only her wedding dress to wear, her prospects were grim. Or she could accept this cowboy's offer of shelter and work. "I'm an excellent cook," she said finally, lifting her chin with a flicker of pride. "And I can clean, sew, and tend a garden." Frank nodded, seeming pleased. "Good. Then it's settled." He gestured toward a hitching post where a handsome chestnut gelding stood waiting. "My horse is over there. We'll have to double up if that's all right with you." Josephine followed him, suddenly aware of how improper this situation would appear back east. But this was the frontier, and different rules applied here. Survival came before propriety. Frank secured her trunk to the back of his saddle, then helped her mount the horse before swinging up behind her. Josephine sat stiffly, conscious of his arms reaching around her to take the reins. "Relax, Miss Darby," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Thunder's a gentle horse, and I promise you're in safe hands." As they rode out of town, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the vast Montana sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The beauty of it momentarily distracted Josephine from her troubles. "It's breathtaking," she murmured. "That it is," Frank agreed. "First time I saw a sunset out here, I knew I'd never want to live anywhere else." "Where are you from originally?" she asked, grateful for the conversation to keep her mind off their proximity. "Pennsylvania. My father was a blacksmith. I came west after the war, looking for something different." Josephine heard what he didn't say, that like so many men, he'd returned from the battlefield changed, unable to settle back into his former life. "I'm from Boston," she offered. "My parents died last winter influenza. I had no family left, no prospects." Frank didn't press for more details, for which she was thankful. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves creating a soothing backdrop to Josephine's thoughts. Eventually, they crested a small rise, and Frank's ranch came into view. It wasn't large by Western standards, a modest 2-story house, a barn, a corral, and a few outbuildings, but it was well-maintained and welcoming, with smoke curling from the chimney. "Home sweet home," Frank said as they approached. "It's not much, but it's mine. Paid for it fair and square with 5 years of cattle drives and saving every penny." "It's lovely," Josephine said sincerely. As they drew closer, a dog came bounding out to greet them, a large, shaggy beast with mismatched ears that barked enthusiastically. "That's Scout," Frank said. "Don't worry, he's friendly. Just excited to see a new face." He dismounted and lifted his hands to help Josephine down. She placed her hands on his shoulders, and he gripped her waist, lifting her effortlessly to the ground. For a brief moment they stood close, and Josephine felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest. Frank stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "Let me show you to your room so you can get settled. You must be exhausted." He carried her trunk inside, and Josephine followed, taking in the simple but comfortable interior of the house. The main floor consisted of a kitchen, a dining area, and a sitting room with a stone fireplace. A staircase led to the second floor. "Your room is up here," Frank said, leading the way. "It gets good light in the morning." The bedroom was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered by a colorful quilt, a chest of drawers, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. A window overlooked the ranch yard and the mountains beyond. Frank set down her trunk at the foot of the bed. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall. It's just a hip bath and a chamber pot. Nothing fancy. There's a pump in the kitchen for water." "This is more than generous," Josephine said, suddenly overwhelmed by his kindness. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need," he replied. "Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning." He hesitated at the door. "Are you hungry? I can heat up some soup." Josephine realized she hadn't eaten since early morning. "Soup would be wonderful, thank you." After he left, she sat on the edge of the bed, allowing herself a moment to absorb the dramatic turn her life had taken. That morning, she had awakened in a stagecoach, heading toward what she thought would be her wedding day. Now, she was alone in a strange man's house, with no money and no plan for the future. And yet, for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope. She opened her trunk and changed out of her wedding dress, putting on a simple blue cotton dress that was wrinkled but clean. She washed her face in the basin, combed her dark hair, and pinned it up as neatly as she could before heading downstairs to join her host. In the kitchen, Frank was stirring a pot on the stove, his hat and gun belt hung by the door. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression made her self-conscious. "Feel better?" he asked, returning his attention to the soup. "Much, thank you." Josephine moved to his side. "May I help?" "You can set the table if you'd like. Bowls are in that cupboard there, spoons in the drawer beside it." They worked together in silence, and soon they were seated across from each other at the small kitchen table, steam rising from bowls of rabbit stew. It was simple fare but hearty and flavorful. "This is delicious," Josephine said after her first spoonful. Frank looked pleased. "One of the few things I can cook without burning. My ma's recipe." "Is your family still in Pennsylvania?" His expression clouded slightly. "No, they're gone. Pa died before the war, Ma after." "I'm sorry," Josephine said softly. He shrugged. "It was a long time ago. What about your parents? You mentioned they passed last winter?" Josephine nodded, setting down her spoon. "They got sick within days of each other. By the time I realized how serious it was too late for the doctor to help." "That's a heavy burden to bear alone." "After they were gone, I had to sell our home to pay the debts. I took a position as a companion to an elderly lady, but she died too, just 3 months later." Josephine's voice wavered. "I had nowhere to go. Then I saw an advertisement seeking a bride for a Montana rancher." "Thomas Blackwell," Frank said. "Yes. He wrote such kind letters. He seemed honest, dependable." She looked down at her half-empty bowl. "I knew it wasn't love, but I thought perhaps it could grow to be, in time." "And now?" Josephine met his gaze directly. "Now I find myself having to start over yet again." "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need," Frank said. "As I mentioned, I could use help with cooking and such. The place has been a mess since Mrs. Holloway left. She was my housekeeper, but her daughter in Denver had a baby, and she went to help out." "I would be happy to earn my keep that way," Josephine replied. "And perhaps you could tell me if there are other opportunities in town. I'm not afraid of hard work." Frank considered this. "Well, the school teacher's been looking for an assistant, and Widow Jenkins runs the general store. She might need help. I can introduce you around in a few days, once you've had a chance to rest." After dinner, Josephine insisted on washing the dishes despite Frank's protests. He finally relented, drying each plate and bowl as she handed it to him. "Do you run this ranch all by yourself?" she asked. "I have a couple of hands who help with the cattle and horses," Frank explained. "Elijah and his son Marcus. They live in a cabin down by the creek. Good men, both of them. You'll meet them tomorrow." When the kitchen was clean, Frank showed her where everything was stored and explained the daily rhythm of ranch life. Then he lit a lantern for her to carry upstairs. "I'll be up at dawn," he said. "But you sleep as long as you need. You've had a long journey." "Thank you for everything, Mr. Harrington," Josephine said, pausing at the bottom of the stairs. "Frank," he corrected gently. "Good night. Miss Darby?" "Josephine," she replied with a small smile. "Good night, Frank." In her room, Josephine sat by the window for a long time, watching as stars emerged in the vast Montana sky. So much had happened in a single day that her head was spinning with it all. She didn't know what the future held, but for tonight at least, she had a roof over her head and the kindness of a stranger to be thankful for. She climbed into bed, expecting to lie awake with worry, but exhaustion claimed her almost immediately. Her last thought before drifting off was of blue eyes and a gentle voice saying, "You've brought enough. You brought you." Josephine woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the distant sound of a rooster crowing. For a disoriented moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and she sat up quickly. She dressed in her second-best dress, a simple brown calico with a white collar, and pinned her hair in a practical bun before making her way downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but a fire crackled in the stove, and a pot of coffee simmered on the back burner. A note propped against a mug caught her attention. "Gone to check the north pasture. Help yourself to breakfast. Back mid-morning. F." Josephine found eggs, bacon, and bread in the pantry and set about preparing a proper meal. By the time Frank returned, she had not only cooked breakfast, but also swept the floors, dusted the sitting room, and started a batch of bread dough. He stopped in the doorway, looking surprised at the transformation. "You've been busy." "Good morning," Josephine said, wiping her hands on her apron, one she'd found hanging on a hook in the pantry. "I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of starting some housework." "Mind? It's been months since this place has looked so tidy." He removed his hat and hung it by the door. "Something smells wonderful. I kept your breakfast warm in the oven," she said, moving to retrieve a plate loaded with eggs, bacon, and thick slices of fried bread. "The coffee is fresh, too." Frank washed his hands at the sink before sitting down at the table. He took a bite of the eggs and closed his eyes briefly in appreciation. Mrs. Holloway was a fine woman, but her cooking couldn't hold a candle to this. Josephine felt a pleasant warmth at the compliment. "My mother believed every young woman should know her way around a kitchen, regardless of her station in life." She was a wise woman. Frank ate with obvious enjoyment, and Josephine found herself watching him, noticing the way the morning light caught the hints of auburn in his brown hair. "I thought I might tackle the laundry today," she said, pulling her gaze away. "And perhaps start a proper dinner. What time do your ranch hands usually eat?" "Elijah and Marcus usually come up to the house around noon, and again at sundown. But you don't need to cook for them at midday. They're used to cold sandwiches." "I don't mind," Josephine assured him. "It gives me something useful to do." Frank finished his breakfast and pushed back from the table. "I need to mend some fencing this morning. Is there anything you need from town? I can ride in later if so." Josephine hesitated. I have no money to buy anything." "Consider it an advance on your wages," Frank said easily. "What do you need?" "Some fabric for sewing, perhaps, and thread. If I'm to stay for any length of time, I'll need to make more suitable clothing for ranch life. She gestured at her dress. This isn't practical for daily work. Write down what you need, and I'll pick it up. He stood, carrying his plate to the sink. And Josephine? Don't work too hard today. You're still recovering from your journey. With that, he left, and Josephine was alone in the house once more. She found herself humming as she worked, a song her mother used to sing while doing the washing. For the first time in months, the weight of grief and uncertainty seemed slightly lighter. By midday, she had bread baking in the oven and a pot of beef stew simmering on the stove, its rich aroma filling the kitchen. She'd also gathered all the laundry she could find and had it soaking in a large tub behind the house. When she heard voices approaching, Josephine smoothed her hair and straightened her apron, suddenly nervous about meeting Frank's ranch hands. She needn't have worried. Elijah was an older black man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, and his son Marcus, in his early 20s, had his father's warm smile. Miss Darby is going to be helping around the house for a while, Frank explained as he introduced them. It's about time this place had a woman's touch again, Elijah said, his voice deep and melodious. Mr. Frank here can rope a steer and break a wild horse, but he can't keep a kitchen clean to save his life. Frank's ears reddened slightly at the good-natured teasing. That's enough of that. Let's eat before the food gets cold. The meal was a pleasant affair, with conversation flowing easily among the four of them. Josephine learned that Elijah had been with Frank since he'd first purchased the ranch 7 years ago, and that Marcus had a talent for working with horses that was unmatched in the territory. Miss Darby came west to be a bride, Frank explained, but her intended passed before she arrived. I'm sorry to hear that, Elijah said, genuine sympathy in his voice. But perhaps it's a blessing in disguise. Thomas Blackwell had a reputation for being difficult. Josephine looked up sharply. Difficult how? The three men exchanged glances. Finally, Marcus spoke. He had a temper. Madam, and he was fond of whiskey. Too fond. I see, Josephine said quietly, a chill running through her at how narrowly she'd escaped what might have been a terrible fate. Well, as you said, perhaps it is a blessing. After lunch, Elijah and Marcus returned to their work, and Frank disappeared into the barn to repair some tack. Josephine finished the laundry, hanging shirts and trousers on the line to dry in the afternoon sun. As she worked, she couldn't help thinking about what might have been if Thomas Blackwell had lived. Would she have found happiness with him, or would she have traded one difficult situation for another? Frank returned from town late in the afternoon with supplies, including everything on Josephine's list, and a few extras: a bar of lavender-scented soap, a small bottle of rose water, and a length of blue ribbon. The soap and such are from Mrs. Jenkins at the store, he explained somewhat awkwardly when Josephine discovered them in the package. When I told her about your situation, she insisted on sending them along, said every lady deserves some little comforts. Josephine was touched by the thoughtfulness. Please thank her for me when you next see her. You can thank her yourself. I mentioned you might be looking for work. And she said to bring you by whenever you're ready. She could use help with inventory and such. That evening, after another satisfying meal and pleasant conversation, Josephine sat in the sitting room with a needle and thread, altering one of the lengths of fabric into a simple work dress. Frank sat in an armchair across from her, reading a dog-eared copy of Moby Dick by the light of a kerosene lamp. The domesticity of the scene struck Josephine suddenly. Here she was, sitting companionably with a man she'd known for barely a day, yet she felt more at ease than she had in months. "What are you thinking about?" Frank asked, looking up from his book to find her staring into the middle distance, needle poised mid-stitch. Josephine blinked, returning to the present. "I was just reflecting on how quickly life can change. Yesterday morning, I had no idea where I would sleep last night or what would become of me, and now here I am, with work to do and a plan for tomorrow." Frank closed his book, keeping a finger between the pages to mark his place. Life out here can change in an instant, for better or worse. You have to be ready to adapt. I'm learning that, she replied. Back east, everything felt more structured, predictable. Do you miss it? Josephine considered the question seriously. I miss certain aspects of it. Cultural refinements, bookshops, concert halls. She smiled slightly. Hot baths that don't require hauling water from a pump. Frank chuckled. We're not completely uncivilized. Pinewood Creek has a lending library, small as it is, and there's a fellow in town who plays the fiddle something beautiful on Saturday nights at the hotel. And the hot baths? His eyes crinkled at the corners. Well, there I can't help you much, though we do have a creek on the property that makes for fine swimming in the summer. Josephine laughed, then quickly covered her mouth, surprised by the sound. It had been so long since she'd laughed freely. That's nice, Frank said, his expression softening. Your laugh. A warm flush crept up Josephine's cheeks, and she returned her attention to her sewing. Tell me about your ranch, she said, changing the subject. How many cattle do you run? Frank allowed the shift in conversation, launching into an explanation of his operation: 50 head of cattle, a dozen horses, plans for expansion. Josephine listened, asking questions that showed genuine interest, and before they knew it, the mantel clock was chiming 10. I should turn in? Josephine said, setting aside her sewing. Morning comes early. Frank stood as she rose, that ingrained courtesy speaking to his upbringing. Sleep well, Josephine. She paused at the foot of the stairs, looking back at him. Thank you again, Frank. For everything. He nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Good night. Upstairs in her room, Josephine sat on the edge of her bed, running her fingers over the soft blue ribbon Frank had brought from town. Such a small thing, yet it represented a kindness she hadn't experienced in a very long time. She fell asleep with the ribbon still clutched in her hand. Her dreams filled with open skies and blue eyes that crinkled when they smiled. The days began to blend together as Josephine settled into life at the Harrington ranch. Each morning, she rose early to prepare breakfast before Frank and the ranch hands began their day. She spent her time cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, and tending to the small kitchen garden behind the house, which had been neglected in Mrs. Holloway's absence. Frank introduced her to people in town as promised, and 3 days a week, Josephine helped Mrs. Jenkins at the general store. The older woman was a widow who had come west with her husband 30 years earlier, when Pinewood Creek was nothing more than a trading post. She took Josephine under her wing, introducing her to other townspeople and sharing local history and gossip. You're staying out at Frank Harrington's place, I hear, said Mrs. Peterson, the milliner's wife, during Josephine's second week in town. Yes, he's been kind enough to offer me room and board in exchange for housekeeping, Josephine replied, carefully neutral. Mrs. Peterson exchanged a significant look with Mrs. Jenkins. He's a good man, Frank is. Keeps to himself mostly, but always the first to lend a hand when someone's in need. He's been very kind, Josephine agreed. And handsome, too, Mrs. Peterson added with a sly smile. Half the single women in the county have set their caps for him over the years, but he never seemed interested. Josephine felt a flush creeping up her neck. I wouldn't know anything about that. Our arrangement is purely practical. Of course, dear, Mrs. Peterson said, her tone suggesting she believed otherwise. Purely practical. Josephine changed the subject quickly, but the conversation stayed with her as she rode home with Frank later that afternoon. They traveled in companionable silence, the rhythmic clop of thunder's hooves and the occasional cry of a hawk, the only sounds breaking the stillness. You're quiet today, Frank observed as they neared the ranch. Just thinking, Josephine replied. Penny for your thoughts? She hesitated, then decided on honesty. Mrs. Peterson seemed to think there might be more than practicality to our arrangement. Frank's posture stiffened slightly. Small towns run on gossip. People will talk no matter what we do. Does it bother you? Josephine asked. The talk? He was quiet for a moment, considering. No, he finally said. Not unless it bothers you. I'm more concerned with doing what's right, Josephine replied carefully. I don't want to compromise your reputation in the community. Frank's chuckle rumbled through his chest. My reputation will survive. I'm more worried about yours. A young woman living under the roof of a bachelor, some might find that scandalous. I've never much cared for other people's opinions, Josephine said, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. Back in Boston, she had always been conscious of social expectations, of doing what was proper. But out here, those constraints seemed less important. Good, Frank said simply. Neither have I. They fell silent again, but something had shifted between them, a new awareness that hummed in the air like electricity before a storm. That evening, as Josephine prepared supper, Frank lingered in the kitchen instead of seeing to his usual evening chores. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as she kneaded bread dough with practiced movements. You make it look easy, he observed. Josephine glanced up, flour dusting her cheeks and forehead. My mother taught me when I was very young. She said a woman who can bake good bread will never go hungry. She was right about that. Josephine covered the dough with a clean cloth and wiped her hands on her apron. Your mother, was she a good cook? A fond smile crossed Frank's face. The best. She could make a feast out of practically nothing. During the lean years, when Pa's blacksmith shop wasn't bringing in much, she'd somehow make a single chicken feed all 5 of us for days. 5? You have siblings? Had. Frank corrected, his smile fading. 2 sisters, both gone now. I'm sorry, Josephine said softly. The war? He nodded, a shadow passing over his features. Typhoid swept through our town in '63. I was away fighting. By the time I got the letter, they were already in the ground. Josephine's heart ached for him. That's why you came west, to escape the memories. Partly, Frank admitted. And partly because there was nothing left for me there. Too many ghosts. Impulsively, Josephine crossed the kitchen and laid a hand on his arm. I understand that feeling all too well. Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment Josephine thought he might reach for her. Instead, he straightened up, gently disengaging from her touch. I should see to the horses before dinner, he said, his voice slightly rough. Marcus mentioned Thunder was favoring his left foreleg earlier. Before Josephine could respond, he was gone, leaving her standing in the kitchen with the lingering warmth of his arm beneath her palm. As spring deepened into summer, Josephine found herself falling into a routine that brought her unexpected contentment. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly useful. Her cooking drew praise not only from Frank and his ranch hands, but also from neighbors who occasionally stopped by. She and Frank settled into a comfortable pattern, sharing meals and evening conversations that grew increasingly personal as their trust in each other deepened. Josephine learned about his experiences during the war, how he'd fought at Gettysburg and Antietam, and how he still sometimes woke in the night, drenched in sweat from dreams of battle. In turn, she told him about her life in Boston, her father's work as a professor of literature, and her mother's involvement in the women's suffrage movement. She spoke of her brief engagement to a young banker, a match arranged by her parents that had ended when he broke it off to marry a girl with a larger dowry. His loss, Frank had said simply when she finished the story, and something in his direct gaze had made her believe it. June brought scorching heat and the beginning of haying season. Frank and the ranch hands worked from dawn to dusk, coming in for meals sweaty and exhausted. Josephine rose even earlier to prepare hearty breakfasts and packed lunches for them to take to the fields. One evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, Josephine walked out to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The day had been particularly hot, and she longed for the cool relief of water. She found a secluded spot where willows drooped over a deep pool, creating a natural screen. After glancing around to ensure she was alone, Josephine removed her shoes and stockings and hiked up her skirts to wade into the water. The shock of cold against her skin made her gasp with delight. She waded deeper until the water lapped just below her knees and closed her eyes, savoring the sensation. The sound of a twig snapping made her eyes fly open. Frank stood on the bank, holding the reins of his horse, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else she couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, starting to turn away. "I didn't mean to intrude." "No, it's all right," Josephine called, though she made no move to exit the creek. "I was just cooling off. The house was stifling." Frank hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and the desire to stay. "I can go. Or you could join me," Josephine suggested, surprising herself with her boldness. "The water feels wonderful." Frank's eyebrows rose, but after a moment's consideration, he tethered his horse to a nearby tree and sat down on the bank to remove his boots and roll up his trouser legs. Josephine watched, her heart beating faster than the heat could account for. He waded into the creek, stopping a respectful distance from her. "You're right," he admitted, the tension in his shoulders visibly easing as the cool water enveloped his calves. "This does feel wonderful." They stood there in companionable silence for several minutes, watching as the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear. "I love this time of day," Josephine said softly, "when everything gets quiet and the world seems to hold its breath." Frank looked at her, the fading light casting shadows across his features. "I've always thought the same thing." Their gazes held, and Josephine felt a current between them that had nothing to do with the flowing creek. Frank took a step closer, and she didn't move away. "Josephine," he said, her name almost a caress on his lips. "Yes?" she whispered. Before he could continue, the distant sound of hoofbeats broke the spell. Frank stepped back, alert now, his hand instinctively moving to his hip where his gun would usually be. "Expecting visitors?" Josephine asked, gathering her skirts and moving toward the bank. "No," Frank replied, his expression grim. "And most folks don't come calling after sundown unless there's trouble." They hurried back to the house, arriving just as a rider came thundering into the yard. It was Marcus, his face tense with urgency. "Mr. Frank, there's a fire at the Johnson place. Lightning strike. They're trying to save the barn." "Go wake your pa," Frank instructed. "We'll ride out straight away." He turned to Josephine. "The Johnsons' farm is about 4 miles east of here. We need to help. They have livestock in that barn." "Of course," Josephine said immediately. "Go. I'll gather supplies, bandages, salve for burns, water." Frank nodded, already striding toward the barn for his horse. "We'll be back when we can." Josephine spent a sleepless night preparing for their return, boiling water for cleaning wounds, tearing old sheets into bandages, and baking bread and making soup for what would surely be hungry men. It was nearly dawn when she heard riders approaching. She rushed outside to find Frank, Elijah, and Marcus dismounting from their horses, their faces streaked with soot, clothes singed in places. They looked exhausted, but unhurt. "The Johnsons?" she asked anxiously. "Safe," Frank assured her. "We managed to get all the livestock out and save most of the barn. Lost the hayloft, but the structure's still standing." "Thank God," Josephine breathed. "Are you hurt? Any of you?" "Just tired and filthy," Frank replied with a weary smile. "And hungry enough to eat a bear." "Then you're in luck," Josephine said, relief making her voice light. "I've got hot water for washing up, and enough food to feed an army." The men ate ravenously, recounting the night's events between bites. When they had finished and Elijah and Marcus had gone to get some rest, Frank lingered at the table nursing a cup of coffee. "You should get some sleep too," Josephine told him. "You've been up all night." "So have you," he pointed out. "I wasn't fighting a fire." Frank studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I rode back into the yard and saw you standing there, waiting, it felt like coming home. Really coming home, in a way I haven't felt since before the war." Josephine's breath caught at the simple honesty of his words. "Frank, let me finish," he said gently. "I know this isn't what you came west for. You came to be a wife, to start a new life with Thomas Blackwell. And instead, you ended up here, working for your keep in a stranger's house." "You're not a stranger anymore," Josephine said softly. Frank's eyes held hers. "No, I suppose I'm not." He drew a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "What I'm trying to say, in my clumsy way, is that I've grown fond of you, Josephine. More than fond. And I was wondering if you might consider staying on, not as my housekeeper, but as something more." Josephine's heart thundered in her chest. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife," Frank said, the words coming out in a rush now. "I know it's sudden, and I know you barely know me, but—" "Yes," Josephine interrupted, her voice steady and sure. Frank blinked. "Yes?" A smile bloomed across Josephine's face, bright as the sunrise beginning to streak the eastern sky. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll marry you." For a moment, Frank seemed stunned by her quick acceptance. Then he was on his feet, circling the table to pull her into his arms. Josephine went willingly, her hands coming up to rest against his chest as he gazed down at her with wonder. "Are you sure?" he asked, giving her one last chance to reconsider. "Life out here isn't easy, even in the best of times." "I'm sure," Josephine replied, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "I came west looking for a fresh start, for a place to belong. I think I've found it with you." Frank's arms tightened around her, and he lowered his head until their foreheads touched. "I'm not a wealthy man," he warned. "I can't give you the kind of life you might have had back east." "I don't want that life," Josephine said firmly. "I want this one. With you." The kiss, when it finally came, was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. Josephine answered by rising on her tiptoes, her arms sliding around his neck as she deepened the contact. Frank's response was immediate and passionate, his arms encircling her waist to draw her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Frank cupped her face in his calloused hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones with tender reverence. "I think I've been falling in love with you since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach," he admitted. Josephine smiled up at him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Even with nothing but tears to my name?" His lips curved in an answering smile. "Especially then." He kissed her again, softly, before repeating the words that had given her hope when all seemed lost. "You brought enough. You brought you." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small whitewashed church in Pinewood Creek. Mrs. Jenkins had insisted on closing the store for the day and had rallied the women of the town to prepare a proper celebration. Tables groaned with food, and someone had brought a fiddle, filling the afternoon with music and laughter. Josephine wore a new dress of pale blue cotton, with the blue ribbon Frank had given her woven into her dark hair. Frank looked handsome in a clean white shirt and black vest, his hair slicked back with water, his face freshly shaved. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Frank's kiss was full of promise, and the cheer that went up from the assembled guests made Josephine blush with pleasure. "Mrs. Harrington," Frank whispered against her ear as they moved to greet their well-wishers. The name sent a thrill through her, a sense of belonging she had almost given up hope of finding again. The celebration lasted well into the evening, but eventually, the newlyweds slipped away, riding double on thunder back to the ranch, their home now, truly shared. That night, as moonlight spilled through the bedroom window of the main house, their bedroom now, Josephine lay in her husband's arms, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. Happy? Frank asked, his fingers gently combing through her unbound hair. Very, she assured him, pressing a kiss to his chest. Are you? His arms tightened around her. More than I ever thought possible. When I saw you standing there in the street that day, looking so lost and yet so determined, I had no idea how completely you would change my life. For the better, I hope, Josephine teased. Frank shifted, rolling to his side so he could look into her eyes. For the better in every way imaginable. In the soft, intimate darkness, they reaffirmed their vows with touches and whispers, discovering each other with the wonder of new lovers and the certainty of souls who had found their match. As summer gave way to autumn, Josephine fell into the rhythm of life as a rancher's wife. The work was constant and sometimes grueling, but she approached each task with determination and increasingly with skill. Under Elijah's patient tutelage, she learned to milk the cows and care for the chickens. Marcus taught her to ride properly, not just perched side saddle as she had been taught back east. Frank watched her transformation with pride and growing love, never failing to express his appreciation for her efforts. Their evenings were precious time together, sometimes spent in quiet conversation, sometimes with Frank reading aloud from one of his small collection of books while Josephine mended or knitted. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom, they discovered the deepening intimacy that comes with true partnership, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal devotion. In October, as the aspen trees blazed golden against the backdrop of evergreens, Josephine made a discovery that filled her with equal parts joy and trepidation. She waited until after dinner, when they were sitting by the fire, to share the news with Frank. I have something to tell you, she began, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Frank looked up from his book, concern immediately crossing his features at her tone. What is it? Are you unwell? Not unwell, no, Josephine said with a small smile. Just changing. His brow furrowed in confusion. Josephine took a deep breath. Frank, I'm going to have a baby. In the spring, I think late April or early May. For a moment he simply stared at her, her words not seeming to register. Then his face transformed with dawning joy. A baby? He repeated, the book forgotten as he moved to kneel before her chair. You're sure? Josephine nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. As sure as I can be. I've missed my monthly courses twice now, and I've been feeling queasy in the mornings. Frank laid a gentle hand on her still flat abdomen, his expression one of awe. A baby, he said again, wonderingly. Our baby. Then he was gathering her into his arms, lifting her from the chair to spin her around in jubilation. Josephine laughed, clinging to his shoulders as the room whirled around them. Careful, she gasped through her laughter. You'll make me dizzy. Frank immediately set her down, his hands steadying her with exaggerated care. I'm sorry, is that all right? Should you be resting? Do you need anything? I could ride into town for... Josephine silenced his barrage of concerned questions with a kiss. I'm fine, she assured him when they broke apart. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm perfectly healthy, and there's no reason to worry. I'll worry anyway, Frank admitted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. It's what husbands do, I'm told. His easy use of the word husband still sent a pleasant shiver through Josephine. After years of uncertainty and loss, she had found not just security but true love, and now the promise of a family. Then we'll worry together, she said softly. But mostly, I think we should be happy. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Frank replied, drawing her close again, this time in a gentle embrace. I love you, Josephine Harrington. You and our child both. Winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in deep snow by mid-November. The world contracted to the warmth of the house, the necessary trips to the barn to tend the animals, and occasional journeys into town for supplies when the weather permitted. Josephine's body began to change, her slender figure softening as the baby grew. Frank watched these changes with fascination and tenderness, his hands gentle on the small swell of her abdomen each night as they lay in bed. Christmas was a quiet but joyful affair. Frank surprised Josephine with a rocking chair he had secretly commissioned from the carpenter in town, its wood polished to a warm glow. For when the baby comes, he explained as she ran her hands over the smooth arms, every mother needs a good rocking chair. Josephine's gift to him was a hand-knitted scarf in soft blue wool, a color she had chosen because it matched his eyes, and the news that she had felt the baby move for the first time. Like butterfly wings, she described, guiding his hand to the spot. Just there. Though Frank couldn't feel the movements yet, the wonder on his face at the very idea of it was gift enough for Josephine. January brought bitter cold and a blizzard that kept them housebound for nearly a week. They passed the time with stories, games of checkers, and plans for the future. Frank talked of expanding the herd, of building a proper nursery off their bedroom, of teaching their child to ride and fish and read. Josephine spoke of planting a bigger garden come spring, of preserving enough food for the winter, of the lullabies she remembered from her own childhood that she would sing to their baby. In February, a letter arrived from Boston, a response to one Josephine had sent months earlier to a childhood friend. The friend had tracked down some of Josephine's family heirlooms that had been sold to pay debts and had purchased them back. A small trunk arrived a week later, containing her mother's silver-backed hairbrush, a porcelain figurine that had stood on the mantel in their Boston home, and a quilt her grandmother had made. Josephine wept with joy at these tangible connections to her past, these pieces of herself she could now share with her child. Frank held her as she cried, understanding the importance of roots, of history, of the bridge between what was and what would be. As March melted into April, the snow receded, revealing the first tender shoots of green beneath. Josephine's time drew closer, and Frank insisted on hiring a girl from town to help with the heavier housework. Lily was 16, eager to learn, and quickly became devoted to Josephine, who treated her with kindness and patience. The baby was active now, kicking and rolling in ways that made Josephine laugh and occasionally groan. Frank could feel these movements too, his face lighting up with childlike delight each time a small foot or hand pressed against his palm. "I think it's going to be a boy," he declared one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "A strong boy with his mother's determination, or a girl with her father's gentle heart," Josephine countered, smiling up at him. "Either way, this child will be loved beyond measure." "That's a certainty," Frank agreed, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. The first pains began in the early morning hours of May 3rd, waking Josephine from a sound sleep. She lay still, counting the minutes between contractions as her mother had once described to her. When they were coming regularly, she gently shook Frank awake. "It's time," she said simply. Frank was immediately alert, his face a mixture of excitement and fear. "I'll get Lily to ride for the midwife." By mid-morning, Josephine was established in their bed, with Mrs. Poir's Peterson, who served as midwife for the area, calmly directing proceedings. Frank had been banished to the kitchen, where he paced like a caged lion, flinching at each cry from upstairs. "Women have been doing this since Eve," Elijah reminded him, having come up to the house when he heard the news. "Miss Josephine is strong. She'll be fine." The labor progressed steadily through the day and into the evening. Just as the first stars appeared in the night sky, a new cry pierced the air, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Frank froze in his tracks, his heart hammering in his chest. Minutes that felt like hours passed before Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, her face wreathed in smiles. "Mr. Harrington," she called, "you have a daughter." Frank took the stairs two at a time, barely hearing the congratulations from Elijah and Marcus behind him. He paused at the bedroom door, suddenly uncertain. "Come in," Mrs. Peterson said, opening the door wider. "Come meet your family." Josephine lay propped against the pillows, her face flushed and damp with sweat, but radiant with happiness. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in the soft blanket Mrs. Jenkins had gifted them. "Frank," Josephine said softly as he approached the bed, "come see our daughter." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling slightly as Josephine passed him the bundle. The baby was tiny, with a cap of dark hair and skin still mottled from birth. As he watched, she yawned, revealing pink gums and a perfect rosebud mouth. "She's beautiful," Frank whispered, tears blurring his vision. "Just like her mother." Josephine reached out to touch his cheek, her fingers gentle on his skin. "What shall we name her?" They had discussed names but had never settled on one, wanting to meet their child first. Frank studied the tiny face, feeling a surge of love so powerful it nearly took his breath away. "Elizabeth," he suggested, "after your mother." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "Elizabeth Rose," she added. "Rose, for your sister." "Elizabeth Rose Harrington," Frank repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect." Mrs. Peterson and Lily slipped quietly from the room, leaving the new family alone together. Frank carefully returned the baby to Josephine's arms before stretching out beside them on the bed, his arm around his wife's shoulders as they gazed down at their daughter in wonder. "I never thought I could be this happy," Josephine murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "When I stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but tears, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." Frank kissed her temple, his heart full to bursting. "You brought everything that mattered. You brought yourself." As the years passed, the Harrington Ranch prospered. Frank's careful management and hard work expanded their herds and acreage. Josephine's garden grew larger, her preserves winning ribbons at the county fair. Elizabeth Lizzie, to her doting parents, grew into a lively, curious child, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's dark hair. When Lizzie was 3, a brother joined the family, Samuel Franklin Harrington, a sturdy boy with his father's build and his mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, another daughter arrived, Grace Margaret, named for Frank's mother. The house expanded along with the family, with Frank adding rooms as needed, always with an eye to comfort and practicality. The original spare room where Josephine had first stayed became a sewing room, then later a schoolroom where she taught the children their letters and numbers before they were old enough to attend the school in town. Life was not without its hardships. A harsh winter in 1883 nearly decimated their cattle herd. Scarlet fever swept through the county in 1885, and though the Harrington children recovered, many others did not. Drought followed by wildfires tested their resilience in the summer of 1887. Through it all, Frank and Josephine faced each challenge together, their bond strengthening with each obstacle overcome. Their love, which had begun in such unlikely circumstances, grew deeper with the passing years, nurtured by shared joys and sorrows, by quiet moments of understanding, and by the family they had created together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Frank surprised Josephine with a trip to Denver, leaving the now teenage Lizzie in charge of her younger siblings with Elijah and Marcus keeping a watchful eye. "It's too much," Josephine protested, even as excitement lit her eyes. "The train tickets alone must have cost a fortune." "Nothing's too much for you," Frank replied, his hair now salted with gray but his eyes still as blue and warm as ever. Besides, I want to show off my beautiful wife in the big city. Denver dazzled them both with its growth and energy. They attended the theater, dined in fine restaurants, and wandered through shops filled with luxuries not available in Pinewood Creek. But on their third night, as they sat in their hotel room, Josephine found herself longing for home. "It's all very grand," she admitted to Frank, "but I miss our house, our children, even the chickens." Frank laughed, drawing her into his arms. "I was thinking the same thing. We've become true country folk, haven't we? Uncomfortable in the city." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Josephine assured him. "I've loved these few days with just you, my love, but home is calling." They returned to the ranch to find everything in good order, the children excited to share their adventures during their parents' absence. That night, as they lay in their own bed, Josephine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Thomas Blackwell had lived?" she asked softly. "If I had married him as planned?" Frank was quiet for a moment, his hand gently stroking her arm. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I look at our life together, at our children, and I can't imagine any other path." "Nor can I," Josephine said, nestling closer to him. "Everything that happened, even the painful parts, led me to you. To this life we've built." Outside their window, the Montana sky spread vast and star-studded above the land they had nurtured together. Inside, wrapped in the warmth of their embrace, lay the truth they had discovered long ago, that love, true and steadfast, could indeed grow from the most barren ground, turning tears of despair into tears of joy. And in the years that followed, as their children grew and began families of their own, as the small town of Pinewood Creek expanded with the coming of the railroad, as the wild frontier gradually yielded to civilization, Frank and Josephine Harrington remained a testament to the power of kindness, of courage, and of the human heart's capacity for love. When visitors came to the ranch, they often remarked on the evident affection between the aging couple, on the comfortable way they moved around each other, anticipating needs before they were spoken. And if someone asked the secret to their enduring happiness, Frank would smile at Josephine, his eyes still crinkling at the corners, and say simply, "She brought everything we needed. She brought herself."